My name is Ida. I'm 58 years old, and 5 years ago, a car accident left me disabled and wheelchair bound. After 30 years of marriage, my husband Richard decided I wasn't enough anymore. He fell for his secretary Natalie, who was 20 years my junior. Today is my divorce day, but I'm smiling. Why? Because I know something about Natalie that Richard doesn't. Something that will change everything when the truth comes out. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to see how I turned the greatest betrayal of my life into my greatest triumph. I met Richard in 1986 when we were both in college. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, the daughter of a teacher and a nurse who instilled in me the value of helping others. That's why I was studying physical therapy while Richard was pursuing his business degree. We met at the campus library, where I was struggling with an anatomy textbook, and he offered to help me study. I remember thinking how handsome he was, with his dark hair and confident smile. There was something about the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams that pulled me in. Our romance was a whirlwind. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. What connected us wasn't just attraction, but our shared ambition and mutual respect. Richard admired my compassion and dedication to helping others, while I was drawn to his drive and vision for the future. We would stay up late in my tiny dorm room, talking about the life we would build together. He wanted to start his own consulting firm someday, and I dreamed of opening a physical therapy practice focusing on children with special needs. After graduation in 1990, we got married in a small ceremony with just our families and closest friends. We couldn't afford anything extravagant because we were both drowning in student loans. Our first apartment was a cramped one-bedroom with secondhand furniture, but it was ours and we were happy. Those early years weren't easy. Richard struggled to find his footing in the corporate world. He went through 3 jobs in 2 years, each ending in disappointment as his innovative ideas were shut down by management too conservative to take risks. I remember him coming home deflated after being told he wasn't management material at a firm he really believed in. That night, I held him as he questioned everything about his career path. "You're too brilliant for them," I told him. "Someday, you'll run your own company and show them all what they missed out on." Meanwhile, I was building my career as a physical therapist at a local hospital. My salary kept us afloat during Richard's professional struggles. I never complained or made him feel less than. We were a team, and I knew his time would come. And it did. Richard's first big break came when a former professor recommended him for a consulting position at a growing tech firm. The company was looking for fresh perspectives, and Richard's ideas finally found receptive ears. I'll never forget the day he came home, picked me up, and spun me around our little kitchen. "They love my proposal, Ida. They're implementing my entire strategy." That was the turning point. With this success under his belt, Richard's career took off. He became known for his innovative approaches to business problems, and clients started specifically requesting him. Within 5 years, he was promoted to senior consultant. During this time, we were also building our family. Our son Jackson was born in 1992, followed by our daughter Diana 2 years later. Balancing 2 careers and 2 young children wasn't easy, but we managed. Richard was an involved father, reading bedtime stories and coaching Jackson's Little League team. We were partners in every sense of the word. As Richard's success grew, so did our financial stability. In 2000, we were able to buy our dream home in an upscale suburb. It was a beautiful colonial with 4 bedrooms and a spacious backyard. I spent months planning every detail from the kitchen layout to the children's rooms. Richard teased me about my detailed spreadsheets and color-coded folders, but he appreciated my thoroughness. The day we moved in, he carried me over the threshold just like on our wedding day. "You made this happen, Ida," he whispered. "Your support made all of this possible." Throughout our marriage, we worked hard to maintain the balance between our careers and family life. When Richard had to travel for work, I would hold down the fort at home. When I had evening appointments with patients, he would make dinner for the kids. We were a well-oiled machine, each supporting the other's goals and dreams. Richard's career continued to soar. By 2010, he was one of the most sought-after business consultants in our region. Companies would pay premium rates for his expertise, and he was invited to speak at major industry conferences. I was so proud of him. Watching him achieve everything he dreamed of was like watching a masterpiece being created brushstroke by brushstroke. For our 25th wedding anniversary in 2015, Richard surprised me with a trip to Paris. It was something we had always talked about, but never found the time for. We spent a week exploring the city, visiting museums, and eating at charming little cafes. On our last night at a restaurant with a view of the Eiffel Tower, Richard raised his glass. "To 25 years with my best friend and greatest supporter," he said. "I wouldn't be where I am without you, Ida." I thought our marriage was as solid as ever. Looking back, I can see the subtle signs I missed. Richard was spending more time at work, coming home later and later. He started checking his phone constantly during our conversations. When I would ask about his day, his answers became vague and short. But I brushed these changes aside, attributing them to the stress of his growing responsibilities. I never imagined that the life we had built together, brick by brick over 3 decades, could crumble so quickly. But sometimes the things we take most for granted are the ones most easily lost. The night everything changed started as a celebration. I had just been promoted to head of physical therapy at the hospital, and Richard suggested we go out for a nice dinner. It was raining heavily, unusual for April, but we didn't want to cancel. The restaurant was about 30 minutes from our home, a fancy place overlooking the lake. The food was delicious, the wine perfectly paired, and Richard seemed more attentive than he had been in months. As we drove home along the winding lakeside road, we were talking about taking a second honeymoon, perhaps to Italy this time. I never saw the deer that leapt onto the road. Richard swerved to avoid it, but the rain-slicked pavement gave no traction. Our car spun, hit the guardrail, and flipped down the embankment. I remember the terrifying sensation of weightlessness, the sound of shattering glass, and then darkness. I woke up in a hospital room surrounded by beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic. Richard was there, his face scratched and his arm in a sling, but otherwise okay. I wasn't so lucky. The impact had damaged my spine and I couldn't feel my legs. The doctors explained that I had sustained severe trauma to my spinal cord. "We won't know the full extent of the damage until the swelling goes down." The neurosurgeon told us, his face serious. "But you should prepare for the possibility of permanent paralysis from the waist down." I underwent 3 surgeries in the span of 2 weeks. The pain was excruciating, but worse was the uncertainty. Each time I went under anesthesia, I hoped to wake up with sensation in my legs. Each time I was disappointed. Richard stayed by my side through it all, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his face growing more haggard with each passing day. When the final prognosis came, it was devastating, but definitive. I would never walk again. The damage to my spinal cord was too severe. I would need to use a wheelchair for the rest of my life. "There's always hope for new treatments in the future," the doctor said, trying to offer some comfort. "But for now, we need to focus on adapting to your new reality." My physical therapy sessions were grueling. As a therapist myself, I knew exactly how hard the road ahead would be. I pushed myself beyond what even my therapist recommended, determined to gain as much independence as possible. Richard attended the first few sessions, watching with a mixture of concern and something else I couldn't quite identify. Was it disappointment? Impatience? I wasn't sure. Coming home was another shock. Our beautiful 2-story house, once so perfect for our family, was now an obstacle course. I couldn't access half the rooms, including our bedroom. Richard immediately hired contractors to modify the house, installing a stair lift, widening doorways, and converting a downstairs office into a bedroom for me. While I appreciated his quick action, I couldn't help feeling like an inconvenience, a problem to be solved, rather than a partner to be supported. The depression hit me hard in those early months. I had spent my career helping others recover their mobility, and now I had lost my own. My identity as a physical therapist seemed like a cruel joke. How could I help patients believe in recovery when my own body had failed me? I had to leave my job, another loss that cut deep. Richard tried to be supportive at first. He would help me with my exercises, make sure I took my medication, and handle the household tasks that had typically been my domain. But I could see the strain it put on him. He was used to being the one receiving support, not providing it. "You're doing great, Ida," he would say. "You're the strongest person I know." But as weeks turned into months, his patience began to wear thin. He would sigh when I needed help transferring from my wheelchair to the bed. He would check his watch repeatedly during my longer therapy sessions. Small irritations became bigger arguments. About 6 months after the accident, I overheard Richard talking to his brother on the phone. He thought I was napping, but I had wheeled myself to the kitchen for a glass of water. "It's like living with a different person," he said, his voice low. "I know it's terrible to say, but sometimes I feel like I've lost my wife. The Ida I married was vibrant, independent. Now everything revolves around her condition. I feel more like a caretaker than a husband." His words cut deeper than any physical pain I had experienced. I silently wheeled myself back to the bedroom and cried into my pillow. Was that really how he saw me now? Not as his partner of nearly 3 decades, but as a burden. Our children reacted differently to my disability. Diana, always our more empathetic child, became fiercely protective. She moved back home temporarily after finishing college to help with my transition. She researched adaptive techniques, joined support groups for families of spinal cord injury survivors, and always made sure I was included in family activities. Jackson, on the other hand, seemed to withdraw. He would visit less frequently, and when he did, he appeared uncomfortable around me. He would address his questions about my health to Richard instead of asking me directly. It hurt, but I tried to understand. He was young, just starting his career, and seeing his once active mother confined to a wheelchair must have been difficult to process. What I didn't realize then was that Jackson's attitude was reflecting his father's. He was taking his cues from Richard, who was already emotionally distancing himself from me in ways I couldn't yet see. The first year after my accident was focused entirely on recovery and adaptation. But as I settled into my new normal, I began to notice Richard's growing distance. He started working later hours, often not coming home until I was already in bed. When I asked about his day, his answers became increasingly vague. "Just the usual client meetings," he would say. "Nothing interesting." I tried to maintain intimacy in our relationship. I spent extra time on my appearance, asked about his projects, and suggested date nights at home when going out was too complicated. But Richard seemed distracted, always checking his phone or bringing work home. Physical intimacy became rare, then non-existent. When I tried to initiate, he would claim exhaustion or stress. "I'm just not in the right headspace right now," became his standard response. About 18 months after my accident, Richard announced he was hiring a personal assistant to help manage his growing client list. "I need someone to keep me organized," he explained. "My calendar is getting out of control, and I'm missing important details." I thought it made sense. Richard's consulting business was busier than ever, and administrative tasks had never been his strong suit. I was actually relieved that he was getting help rather than trying to do everything himself. I met Natalie for the first time at Richard's company Christmas party. It was one of my first major outings since the accident, and I was nervous about navigating the venue in my wheelchair. Richard had been reluctant to bring me, suggesting it might be too tiring, but I insisted. Natalie was striking in a way that immediately made me self-conscious. Tall, slim, with long auburn hair and a dazzling smile, she couldn't have been more than 38. She wore a fitted black dress that highlighted every advantage, while I sat in my wheelchair in an adapted pantsuit that prioritized comfort over style. "So you're the famous Ida," she said, bending down to my level in a gesture that felt patronizing. "Richard talks about you constantly. It's so inspiring how you've handled your situation." There was something about her that felt off, a calculation behind her warm smile that made me uneasy, but I dismissed it as my own insecurity. After all, she was perfectly pleasant, bringing me drinks and making sure I was included in conversations. Richard seemed pleased that we were getting along, though I noticed he kept glancing at her throughout the evening. In the weeks that followed, Richard began mentioning Natalie frequently in conversation. Natalie found this great new client management software. Natalie suggested a new approach for the Peterson project. Natalie stayed late to help me prepare for the board presentation. It was always Natalie this, Natalie that. I tried to be supportive, grateful that he had competent help at work, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Then came the physical changes. Richard, who had worn the same cologne for 15 years, suddenly switched to something new and more expensive. He updated his wardrobe, replacing his practical suits with designer labels. He joined a gym and became obsessive about his appearance in a way he never had been before. At 59, he started dyeing the gray out of his hair. When I complimented his new look, his explanation was always work-related. Image is important when you're dealing with high-level executives, he would say. First impressions matter. But it wasn't just his appearance that was changing. He became critical of mine. Before the accident, Richard had always told me I was beautiful just as I was. Now, he would make helpful suggestions. Maybe you should try that new haircut Diana mentioned. That top doesn't really flatter you. Each comment chipped away at my already fragile self-esteem. Then I found the receipts. I was organizing our home office when I came across a credit card statement with charges from restaurants I'd never heard of, all on evenings when Richard had claimed to be working late. There was also a charge from a jewelry store for an amount that made my heart sink. When I confronted him, he dismissed my concerns. Those were business dinners, Ida. The jewelry was a retirement gift for a client. Why are you checking up on me? Don't you trust me after all these years? I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But the doubt had taken root. We had our first major argument a few weeks later. Richard had promised to take me to a physical therapy appointment, but called last minute to cancel, citing an emergency client meeting. When he came home that night, I could smell unfamiliar perfume on his collar. I'm doing everything I can to recover, I told him, my voice shaking with emotion. But I feel like you're not even trying to save our marriage. What's that supposed to mean? He snapped. I'm working myself to the bone to support this family, to pay for your treatments and all the modifications to the house. And it's never enough for you. Maybe if you tried harder in therapy, you'd be more independent by now. His words felt like a slap. I had been pushing myself to the limit in every therapy session. My therapist often had to remind me not to overdo it. For Richard to suggest I wasn't trying hard enough was beyond cruel. After that fight, I doubled my efforts in therapy. Not for Richard, but for myself. I needed to prove that I was doing everything possible to regain independence. I worked until my arms shook from exhaustion, until calluses formed on my palms, from wheeling my chair until sweat soaked through my clothes. But no amount of effort could fix what was breaking between us. When Richard missed my important follow-up appointment with the neurosurgeon to work, I knew something was seriously wrong. This was the appointment where we would discuss experimental treatments. The old Richard would never have missed it. My birthday that year was the final confirmation I needed. Richard took me to dinner at an upscale restaurant, but spent the entire meal distracted by messages on his phone. He barely looked at me as I opened his gift, a generic scarf that showed no thought or knowledge of my taste. As we drove home in silence, I wondered when I had become invisible to the man who once couldn't take his eyes off me. The truth came from Diana a week later. She came to visit, her expression unusually serious. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "I saw Dad yesterday. He was at Cafe Lorraine with his assistant. They weren't discussing business, Mom. He was holding her hand across the table. I'm so sorry." I thanked Diana for her honesty, assured her this wasn't her burden to bear, and waited until she left before allowing myself to fall apart. The truth was finally out in the open, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. The lipstick on Richard's collar was coral pink. I noticed it the moment he leaned down to kiss my cheek, a perfunctory greeting, before heading upstairs to change. It stood out against the crisp white fabric like a neon sign of his betrayal. I had never worn coral lipstick in my life, always preferring more subtle shades. But more importantly, I had not kissed his cheek that morning. I hadn't even seen him before he left for work. That night, I confronted him with the evidence literally in hand, his shirt collar pinched between my fingers. "Are you going to tell me the truth now?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt inside. Richard's denial was almost laughable in its lack of conviction. He claimed it must be from a client who had hugged him after a successful meeting. When I pointed out that professional women don't generally leave lipstick on their male colleagues, he grew defensive. "What are you suggesting, Ida, that I'm having an affair? After 30 years of marriage, is that what you think of me?" But his indignation rang hollow, and we both knew it. Still, he maintained his innocence, and I was left with suspicion but no confirmation. Soon after, Richard began staying overnight at hotels near clients to avoid late-night drives. Sometimes he would be gone for 2 or 3 nights a week. The distance between us grew from a crack to a chasm. I needed to know the truth one way or another. My friend Marjorie had been urging me to investigate for weeks, and I finally agreed. Marjorie was a retired school principal with time on her hands and a fiercely protective attitude toward her friends. She offered to follow Richard after he left the office one evening. "You deserve to know what you're dealing with," she insisted. "This limbo is worse than any truth could be." I agreed, though the thought of spying on my husband made me feel ill. But Marjorie was right. The uncertainty was eating me alive. 2 days later, Marjorie came to my house with her phone in hand, her expression grave. She sat beside me on the sofa and took my hand. "I'm so sorry, Ida," she said, "but you need to see this." She showed me a series of photos taken outside an upscale apartment building I didn't recognize. There was Richard arriving with an overnight bag, and there was Natalie greeting him at the door with a kiss that was anything but professional. The final photo showed them through a window embracing in what was clearly Natalie's living room. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Even though I had suspected the truth, seeing it confirmed was devastating. 30 years of marriage reduced to a clandestine affair with a younger woman. The betrayal was complete. When Richard came home the next day, I was waiting with the photos displayed on the kitchen table. The moment he saw them, his face crumpled, not with shame, but with anger at being caught. "You had me followed," he demanded, as if my investigating was the real transgression. "You gave me no choice, Aroye," I replied. "You've been lying to me for months." His confession, when it finally came, was half-hearted at best. "It just happened, Ida," he said, running his hand through his freshly dyed hair. "It wasn't planned. Natalie and I started working late together, and one thing led to another. These things happen. 30 years of marriage, and that's your explanation. These things happen." He couldn't meet my eyes as he delivered the final blow. "I need someone whole, Ida. Someone who can keep up with me, who doesn't need to be taken care of. I never signed up to be a caretaker for the rest of my life." The cruelty of his words left me speechless. He had promised to love me in sickness and in health. My disability was the result of an accident, not a choice. And now he was discarding me like broken merchandise that no longer functioned to his specifications. After Richard left, I broke down completely. The sobs racked my body until I could barely breathe, until my throat was raw and my eyes swollen. This was how Diana found me when she stopped by unexpectedly with groceries. Mom, what happened?" Through broken sentences, I managed to tell her about the affair, the confrontation, what her father had said. Diana's face flushed with fury. "How dare he?" she whispered. "How dare he do this to you after everything you've done for him, after the way you supported him for years?" She insisted on staying the night, calling into work to take a personal day. Her protective instinct was touching a small comfort in the midst of such pain. Jackson's reaction was different when Diana called to tell him. He came over the next day angry not at his father, but at me. "There must be more to the story," he insisted. "Dad wouldn't just throw away his marriage for no reason. What did you do, Mom? How did you drive him to this? His words were like knives, all the more painful coming from my son. Diana jumped to my defense, and the two siblings argued bitterly until Jackson stormed out. Another casualty of Richard's betrayal, the close relationship between my children. Richard moved out the next day, taking only what he needed for work and daily living. He said he would send for the rest later. The house felt both emptier and somehow less suffocating without his presence. I wheeled from room to room, looking at the photographs on the walls, the evidence of a life built together, wondering how much of it had been real. Depression consumed me in the weeks that followed. I stopped going to physical therapy, stopped calling friends back, barely ate enough to sustain myself. What was the point of fighting to be independent if the person I had built my life around saw me as nothing but a burden? Diana, worried about my mental state, temporarily moved back home. She worked remotely during the day and spent evenings trying to engage me in conversation, in activities, in anything that might pull me out of the darkness. Her presence was the only thing that kept me tethered to the world. Then came the final insult, the divorce papers delivered by courier in a crisp manila envelope. Richard wasn't even willing to face me for this final step in dismantling our marriage. The terms of his proposed settlement were shocking in their meanness of spirit. He was offering minimal spousal support despite his considerable income. He wanted the house sold and the proceeds split, which would force me to find a new accessible place to live. He was claiming half of our retirement savings, much of which had accumulated during the years I supported him as he built his career. It was in reading these papers, seeing in black and white how little he valued our history together, that something shifted inside me. Sadness gave way to anger, and anger eventually to resolve. If Richard thought I would simply roll over and accept these terms, he had forgotten who I was. I had supported him when he had nothing, believed in him when no one else did. I deserved better than this, disability or not. The divorce papers were a wake-up call. Richard had been planning this for months, positioning himself for a clean break with minimal financial impact. Well, two could play at that game. I might be in a wheelchair, but my mind was as sharp as ever. It was time to stop wallowing and start fighting. The day after receiving the divorce papers, I called Susan, my college roommate, and now a private investigator in Chicago. We had kept in touch over the years, meeting for lunch whenever she was in town. I had attended her wedding, and she had sent flowers when she heard about my accident. She answered on the first ring. "Ida, it's been too long. How are you holding up?" I gave her a brief overview of my situation, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained Richard's affair and the impending divorce. "That absolute rat," Susan said, her voice tight with anger. "I never thought Richard would do something like this. Not to you." "Neither did I admitted. "But here we are. And Susan, I need a favor. It's a big one." "Anything," she said without hesitation. "Just name it." I took a deep breath. "I need you to look into Natalie Pearson. She's Richard's assistant and now apparently his girlfriend. Something about her just feels off to me. Call it intuition. You think she's not who she claims to be. I don't know, but Richard has fallen for her hard and fast. He's throwing away 30 years of marriage. I need to know what he's walking into." Susan didn't question my motives or suggest I was just being a jealous wife. That was one of the things I had always loved about her willingness to trust my judgment. "Send me everything you have on her, starting with her full name and date of birth if you know it. I'll see what I can dig up." Over the next week, I sent Susan every scrap of information I could find. I remembered Natalie's birthday because Richard had mentioned leaving work early to take the team out that day. I had Natalie's work email address from company communications. I even found her LinkedIn profile, which listed her previous employment at 2 other consulting firms. Susan's initial findings arrived via encrypted email 10 days later. "Something's definitely not adding up," she wrote. I checked with the firms listed on her resume. One has no record of ever employing her. The other confirms she worked there, but was let go after only 6 months, not the 2 years she claims. And her educational background is sketchy too. The MBA she lists from Northwestern, They have no record of a graduate by that name in the years she claims to have attended. This was intriguing, but not necessarily sinister. People embellished resumes all the time. I needed more. Susan's breakthrough came a week later. She called me, her voice excited. Ida, I found something big. Natalie Pearson isn't her original name. She changed it legally 5 years ago. She used to be Nicole Sanders. Why would she change her name? I asked. That's the interesting part. I found an old news article from a small paper in Oregon. Nicole Sanders was implicated in a fraud case involving a tech executive named Martin Gruber. She was his assistant, then girlfriend. She gained access to company accounts and transferred nearly $100,000 to her personal account. Charges were filed, but eventually dropped. She got away with it? I asked, incredulous. Seems like it. Gruber suddenly refused to cooperate with the investigation. My guess is she threatened to reveal something personal that would damage his reputation or marriage. This was starting to make sense. The pieces were falling into place. There's more, Susan continued. Once I had her original name, I found a pattern. Before Gruber, there was a wealth manager in Seattle named Donovan, and before him, a surgeon in San Diego named Weiss. In each case, she was employed as an assistant or office manager, became romantically involved with her boss, and left under a cloud of financial irregularities. She's a con artist, I whispered. Looks that way, and she's good at covering her tracks. But I've got a friend at the Financial Crimes Division who owes me a favor. He did some digging and found offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands linked to her. She's been siphoning money for years. My mind was reeling. Richard wasn't just having an affair with his secretary, he was being played by a practiced con woman. Part of me wanted to call him immediately to warn him. But another part, a harder part that had emerged through the pain of his betrayal, thought he deserved what was coming. There's one more thing you should know, Susan said. Her academic credentials are completely fabricated. She never attended Northwestern or UC Berkeley as she claims. She barely finished high school. I thanked Susan for her thorough investigation and promised to keep her updated. After hanging up, I sat in silence processing what I had learned. Natalie or Nicole was systematically targeting successful men, gaining their trust and then exploiting them. Richard was just her latest mark. I spent days wrestling with what to do with this information. Diana urged me to use it immediately. You have to tell Dad, she insisted. Whatever he's done, he doesn't deserve to be scammed. But Jackson, who had finally started to see his father's actions more clearly, had a different perspective. Maybe this is the lesson he needs to learn, he said during a rare visit. He threw away a real relationship for something fake. There's a certain justice to that. I understood both perspectives. Richard had hurt me deeply, but did that mean I should let him walk into a trap? In the end, I decided to consult with a divorce attorney before making any moves. I needed professional guidance on how to proceed. Gloria Hamilton was the top divorce attorney in our city, known for her strategic brilliance and unwavering advocacy for her clients. Her office was in a historic building downtown the interior, a blend of classic architecture and modern design. Despite her stellar reputation, she was warm and approachable in person. Mrs. Anderson, she said, shaking my hand firmly, I've reviewed the documents you sent over. First, let me say I'm sorry for what you're going through. Divorce after 30 years is difficult under any circumstances. Add in your medical situation and your husband's infidelity, and it's particularly challenging. I appreciated her directness. Thank you. I'm still trying to process everything. That's understandable. Now, about these findings regarding your husband's girlfriend. This is valuable information, but timing is everything in how we use it. What do you mean? Gloria leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. If we reveal what we know too early, she might disappear, taking whatever assets she's already accessed with her. If we wait too long, she could do significant financial damage. We need to gather more evidence and present it at precisely the right moment for maximum impact. When would that be? I asked. The final divorce hearing, Gloria said with a small smile. When everything is on public record and when your husband is most vulnerable. Trust me, the judge will take a very different view of the asset division when this information comes to light. Her strategy made sense. We would compile all the evidence of Natalie's fraudulent past, her financial manipulations, and her pattern of targeting wealthy men. We would document any unusual financial activities in Richard's accounts since his relationship with her began, and we would present it all at the moment it would do the most good for my case. In the meantime, Gloria advised, maintain the appearance of a resigned, defeated spouse. Let your husband think you're accepting his terms. It will make our countermove all the more effective. As I left Gloria's office, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since discovering Richard's betrayal, I had a plan. I wasn't just a victim of circumstances. I was taking control of the situation. While Richard was blinded by infatuation, I was clear-eyed and strategic. I started focusing on rebuilding my strength and independence. I returned to physical therapy with renewed determination. I consulted with a financial advisor to understand our marital assets better and prepare for my future as a single woman. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during my depression. The path ahead was still daunting, but now I was moving forward with purpose rather than being dragged along by Richard's choices. I had information he didn't have, and knowledge, as they say, is power. I just needed to be patient and let events unfold. As the divorce proceedings began in earnest, Richard's approach revealed how completely he had transformed from the partner I once knew into someone barely recognizable. His legal team was aggressive, making demands that went far beyond what would be considered fair after a 30-year marriage where I had been an equal contributor to our success. They demanded financial records going back 5 years, questioned expenses I had made for medical equipment, and even suggested I had hidden assets, a laughable accusation, considering my limited mobility and Richard's complete control of our finances in recent years. Throughout it all, I maintained the appearance of compliance and non-confrontation that Gloria had advised. I provided all requested documents, promptly responded to their demands without complaint, and never once mentioned what I knew about Natalie. In our required mediation sessions, I appeared resigned and defeated, letting Richard believe his strategy was working. Meanwhile, Richard was flaunting his relationship with Natalie publicly. They appeared together at business functions, dined at expensive restaurants, and even took weekend trips to wine country. He seemed oblivious to how his behavior might influence the divorce proceedings or affect his relationships with our children. Diana refused to be in the same room with Natalie and had limited her contact with her father to terse phone calls. Jackson, while still more sympathetic to Richard, had begun to question his father's choices after seeing how happily Richard had moved on while I was still struggling with the fallout of his abandonment. Through Susan's continued investigation, we learned that Natalie had been pushing Richard to accelerate the divorce timeline. She had convinced him to put her name on the lease of a luxury apartment and to add her as an authorized user on his credit cards. Most alarmingly, she had been researching prenuptial agreements, clearly planning to secure her position legally once our divorce was final. One evening, Richard called to inform me of his plans, his voice falsely casual. "Just so you know, Natalie and I are getting married as soon as the divorce is finalized. We've already planned the ceremony." "That seems like quick," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "When you know," he said with a smugness that made my skin crawl. "We're not getting any younger, and we want to start our life together officially." What he didn't say, but I understood clearly, was that he wanted to replace me as quickly as possible to prove to himself and others that leaving me had been the right choice. Natalie, of course, had her own motivations for rushing to the altar. The next day, social media was flooded with their engagement announcement. Natalie posted pictures of an enormous diamond ring, easily worth more than what Richard had spent on my engagement and wedding rings combined. There were photos of them looking radiant at an expensive restaurant, champagne glasses raised in celebration. The caption read, "When you find true love later in life, you don't wait. So excited to begin this journey with my soulmate." The comments were filled with congratulations from Richard's colleagues and acquaintances who either didn't know about me or chose to ignore the circumstances. A few loyal friends posted thinly veiled criticisms, quickly deleted by Natalie, who managed Richard's social media accounts now. My friends were outraged on my behalf. Marjorie called me immediately after seeing the posts. The nerve of that woman, and Richard parroting around like some lovesick teenager when the ink isn't even dry on your divorce papers. It's disgusting. It's all part of her plan, I said calmly. The more public their relationship, the harder it will be for Richard to back out when he learns the truth. Marjorie was silent for a moment. Ida Anderson, there's a steely core to you I never fully appreciated until now. I'm proud of you. As we approached the final stages of the divorce, Susan and Gloria collaborated to compile all the evidence against Natalie. The documentation was comprehensive and damning. Name changes, fraudulent resume claims, pattern of targeting wealthy men offshore accounts, and evidence of funds already being diverted from Richard's accounts that he likely wasn't aware of. Richard rejected every fair settlement offer we proposed, emboldened by his legal team and Natalie's influence. He wanted a clean break with a minimal financial obligation to me, despite my disability and the decades I had invested in our marriage. His latest demand was that I vacate our home within 30 days of the divorce decree, a particularly cruel requirement given the modifications that had been made for my accessibility. Mediation failed completely, with Richard unwilling to compromise on any significant point. His lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit, made it clear they were prepared to go to court confident in their position. Little did they know we were counting on exactly that outcome. We agreed to a final hearing before the judge where all issues would be decided. Richard, eager to finalize the divorce and marry Natalie, pushed for the earliest possible date. The court scheduled our hearing for October 15th, exactly 5 months after Richard had moved out. The day before the hearing, I met with Gloria to review our strategy one final time. Her office felt like a war room, with documents spread across her conference table and a presentation prepared for the judge. Remember, Gloria said, timing is everything tomorrow. We let them present their case first, let Richard think he's winning, and then we introduce our evidence about Miss Pearson. The judge needs to see the full picture of what's happening here, not just a disabled wife being left by her husband, but a calculated con being perpetrated. I nodded, a mixture of nervousness and determination coursing through me. I understand, and Richard really has no idea what's coming. Gloria smiled, a predator's smile. Not a clue. Men like your husband, blinded by ego and infatuation, rarely see the truth until it's too late. By this time tomorrow, he'll be facing a very different reality. That night, I barely slept, not from anxiety about the hearing, but from a strange sense of anticipation. For months, I had been playing the role of the defeated wife, swallowing Richard's cruelty and Natalie's smug triumph. Tomorrow, the tables would turn. It wasn't about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction in the thought. It was about justice, about not allowing myself to be discarded after 30 years of partnership, about not letting a con artist profit from my pain. As dawn broke, I wheeled to the window and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Whatever happened today, I would face it with dignity and strength. Richard had underestimated me, forgotten who I was beyond my disability. Today would be a reminder not just for him, but for myself as well. I was still Ida Anderson, and I was nobody's victim. The county courthouse was an imposing granite building, its wide steps and heavy wooden doors, a testament to an era before accessibility was considered. I entered through the side entrance where a ramp had been added as a reluctant concession to modern requirements. The irony wasn't lost on me, this physical manifestation of being an afterthought, an accommodation rather than a design priority, much like my status in Richard's life now. Gloria met me in the lobby, impeccable, in a navy suit that radiated authority. Her confidence was reassuring as she guided me toward the courtroom. We had arrived early to set up our presentation and ensure everything was in order. "Are you ready?" she asked, her eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. "More than ready," I assured her. "Let's finish this." We entered courtroom 3 to find it still mostly empty. Richard and his team hadn't arrived yet. Gloria arranged our materials on the table while I positioned my wheelchair at an angle that would allow me to see both the judge and Richard throughout the proceedings. At precisely 9:30, Richard entered with his attorney and Natalie. His appearance shocked me, though I kept my expression neutral. In just 5 months, he had transformed himself. Hair perfectly dyed and styled face suspiciously smooth for his 60 years, designer suit that must have cost thousands. He looked like a caricature of a successful man having a midlife crisis. Natalie was equally overstyled, her auburn hair falling in perfect waves, her makeup flawless, her dress expensive, but just conservative enough for court. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had already won, who was just waiting to collect her prize. When she saw me, her eyes flickered with something like pity mixed with triumph. She leaned into Richard possessively, her diamond engagement ring catching the light as she placed her hand on his arm. Richard nodded stiffly in my direction, but didn't approach. Instead, he took his seat at the opposite table, Natalie beside him, despite the raised eyebrows of his attorney. It was irregular for a non-spouse to sit at counsel's table, but Richard apparently insisted. It would prove to be a strategic error. Judge Eleanor Warner entered a woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for games in her courtroom. She reviewed the case file briefly before addressing us. "Good morning. We're here for the final hearing in the matter of Anderson v. Anderson case number 2024 D475. I've reviewed the filings and the failed mediation report. It seems we have significant disagreement on several key issues that need to be resolved. Mr. Thompson, as counsel for the petitioner, please present your client's position first." Richard's attorney stood a tall man with the practiced sincerity of someone who had been arguing cases for decades. "Thank you, Your Honor. My client, Richard Anderson, is seeking an equitable division of assets accumulated during this 30-year marriage. While he acknowledges Mrs. Anderson's unfortunate disability, he believes the proposed settlement is more than generous given the circumstances." What followed was a clinical dismantling of our marriage reduced to dollar figures and percentages. According to Thompson, Richard deserved the lion's share of our assets because he had been the primary breadwinner in recent years. My contributions, both financial and non-financial, were minimized or ignored entirely. My disability was portrayed as an unfortunate but irrelevant factor in the asset division. Throughout this presentation, Richard sat with a slight smile, occasionally nodding in agreement. Natalie took notes, playing the role of the supportive partner. I remained expressionless, following Gloria's advice to appear resigned but attentive. When Thompson finished, Judge Warner turned to Gloria. "Ms. Hamilton, please present your client's position." Gloria rose gracefully, her manner respectful but confident. "Your Honor, we strongly disagree with Mr. Thompson's characterization of this marriage and the contributions of my client, Ida Anderson. For 30 years, Mrs. Anderson was not just a wife, but a true partner to Mr. Anderson. When his career was just beginning, she was the primary breadwinner. She supported him through multiple failed business ventures. She raised their children while maintaining her own career. And when she suffered a devastating accident that left her permanently disabled, Mr. Anderson abandoned her for a younger woman." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Gloria continued. "We believe that after 30 years of marriage, Mrs. Anderson is entitled to an equal division of assets, appropriate spousal support, given her disability and the lifestyle they established together, and the right to remain in their home, which has been specifically modified for her accessibility needs." Judge Warner nodded thoughtfully. "Ms. Hamilton, do you have documentation of Mrs. Anderson's financial contributions during the marriage?" "Yes, Your Honor." Gloria presented a thorough financial history highlighting the years when my income had sustained our family, the joint investments we had made, and my non-financial contributions to Richard's career success. As Gloria made our case, I watched Richard's expression shift from confidence to irritation. He clearly hadn't expected such a well-documented presentation of my contributions. He leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, who frowned and shook his head slightly. After both sides had presented their initial arguments, Judge Warner sighed. I see two very different pictures of this marriage being painted. Before I make any decisions, I want to hear from the parties directly. Mr. Anderson, would you please take the stand? Richard seemed pleased at the opportunity to tell his version of events. After being sworn in, he presented himself as a dedicated husband who had tried his best to support me after my accident, but eventually found the role of caretaker overwhelming. He spoke of his need for companionship and understanding that I supposedly could no longer provide. He painted himself as a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of betrayal. When it was my turn to take the stand, I wheeled forward with quiet dignity. After the oath, Gloria began her gentle questioning, allowing me to tell our story, the real story of our marriage and its dissolution. I spoke without bitterness, focusing on facts rather than emotions which seemed to impress Judge Warner. Mrs. Anderson, the judge asked, after both attorneys had questioned me, is there anything else you would like the court to consider in making its decision? This was the moment we had planned for. I looked directly at the judge, then briefly at Richard before answering. Yes, Your Honor. There is a matter of significant concern that impacts not only the fair division of our marital assets, but potentially criminal activity that the court should be aware of. Richard's head snapped up, his expression suddenly wary. Natalie shifted in her seat, her confident posture faltering slightly. I've recently discovered that my husband's fiancée, Natalie Pearson, is not who she claims to be. She has a history of targeting wealthy professionals, gaining their trust and access to their finances, and then defrauding them. The courtroom fell silent. Richard's face registered confusion, then disbelief. Natalie's expression hardened into a mask of indignation. Your Honor, this is ridiculous, Thompson interjected. These unfounded accusations have no bearing on the divorce proceedings and appear to be nothing more than a desperate attempt to malign Mr. Anderson's character by attacking his current relationship. Judge Warner held up her hand. Ms. Hamilton, do you have evidence to support these serious allegations? We do, Your Honor, Gloria replied, standing and lifting a thick folder from our table. With the court's permission, I would like to present documentation that Ms. Pearson, formerly known as Nicole Sanders, has a pattern of fraudulent behavior across multiple states. We also have evidence that funds have already been diverted from Mr. Anderson's accounts to offshore holdings controlled by Ms. Pearson. As Gloria presented the meticulous documentation Susan had compiled, Richard's expression shifted from disbelief to shock to fury. He stared at Natalie, who had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup. She whispered frantically to him, but he jerked away from her touch, his body language suddenly hostile. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Name changes documented through court records, news articles about previous fraud allegations, employment records showing fabricated job histories, bank statements revealing suspicious transfers. A clear pattern emerged of a calculated con artist who had made a career of exploiting successful men. Furthermore, Gloria continued, we have reason to believe that Miss Pearson has been accelerating the divorce timeline and pushing for a quick marriage to solidify her access to Mr. Anderson's assets before her true nature could be discovered. We believe this constitutes an attempt to defraud not just Mr. Anderson, but potentially this court in its division of marital assets. Judge Warner's expression had grown increasingly grave as she reviewed the evidence. Mr. Thompson, were you aware of any of this information? Richard's attorney looked stunned. No, Your Honor. This is the first I'm hearing of these allegations. They're lies, Natalie suddenly exclaimed, jumping to her feet. This is a smear campaign by a bitter, disabled woman who can't accept that her husband has moved on. Miss Pearson, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed from my courtroom, Judge Warner said sharply. You are not a party to this case, and you have not been given permission to speak. Natalie sat, her face flushed with anger or fear, perhaps both. Your Honor, Gloria said calmly, we request that the court take this information into consideration when determining the fair division of assets. We also ask that the court issue an immediate order freezing any joint accounts Mr. Anderson may have established with Ms. Pearson to prevent further potential fraud. Judge Warner nodded. I'm inclined to grant that request immediately. This is deeply troubling information. She turned to Richard. Mr. Anderson, given this new information, do you wish to reconsider your position regarding the division of marital assets? Richard looked shell-shocked. He turned to Natalie, who was now avoiding his gaze, then back to the judge. I need time to process this, Your Honor. If these allegations are true— They're not true, Natalie hissed, grabbing his arm. She's manipulating you. Can't you see that? Richard pulled his arm away. Then explain the name change, Natalie. Explain the offshore accounts. Explain why that news article has your picture with a different name. Natalie stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. This is a setup. She grabbed her purse and started toward the door. Miss Pearson, I have not dismissed this court, Judge Warner said sharply. Court security, please ensure Miss Pearson remains in the building. I believe the district attorney's office will want to speak with her regarding these allegations. 2 court officers moved to block Natalie's exit. Her face contorted with fury as she realized she was trapped. Your Honor, Gloria said, given these extraordinary circumstances, we request a brief recess to allow Mr. Anderson to review the evidence and potentially reconsider his position. Judge Warner agreed, calling a 30-minute recess. As the court officers escorted Natalie to a conference room for questioning, Richard sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. For the first time since our separation, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. He had been cruel in his abandonment of me, but he had also been deceived by a practiced con artist. I wheeled myself out of the courtroom, followed by Gloria. In the hallway, she squeezed my shoulder. You did beautifully, Ida, composed and dignified throughout. The judge is clearly sympathetic to your position. What happens now? I asked. Now we wait. Richard has 2 choices: continue fighting us and risk public exposure of how thoroughly he was duped, or negotiate a fair settlement that allows both of you to move forward with dignity. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, Richard's demeanor had completely changed. Gone was the arrogant, impatient man eager to start his new life. In his place sat someone who looked years older, humbled by the revelation of his own gullibility. Natalie was noticeably absent, presumably still being questioned by authorities. Richard's attorney addressed the court. Your Honor, in light of this new information, my client wishes to withdraw his previous settlement proposal and work toward a more equitable resolution. Judge Warner nodded. I believe that's a wise decision, Mr. Thompson. I'm going to order a full financial audit to determine if any marital assets have been compromised. In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary order that Mrs. Anderson may remain in the marital home, with Mr. Anderson continuing to cover all associated costs and her medical expenses. We'll reconvene once the audit is complete to finalize the asset division. As we prepared to leave the courtroom, Richard approached me, his attorney hovering nervously nearby. Ida, he said quietly, his voice lacking its recent arrogance. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Richard, I replied, my voice calm. We'll let the lawyers handle things from here. Did you know about Natalie, I mean? When did you find out? I looked at him directly. This man I had loved for 30 years, now a stranger to me. I've known for months. I could have warned you, but you made it clear my input wasn't welcome in your new life. He flinched at that. I deserve that, I suppose. This isn't about what anyone deserves, Richard. It's about justice and moving forward with integrity. As I wheeled away, I felt no triumph, no vindictive pleasure in his humiliation. Only a quiet satisfaction that I had stood up for myself, that I had refused to be discarded without a fight. The wheelchair that Richard had seen as a symbol of my weakness had become the seat of my strength. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun was bright. I took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling lighter than I had in months. The road ahead would still have challenges, but I would face them on my terms with my dignity intact. Diana was waiting by the car, her expression anxious until she saw my smile. "Mom, how did it go?" "Let's just say justice was served," I replied, reaching for her hand, "and I think it's time for us to go home." In the months that followed the courthouse revelation, my life transformed in ways I never could have anticipated. The divorce was finalized with terms that far exceeded what Richard had initially offered. I kept the family home with Richard covering the mortgage and maintenance costs. The retirement accounts were divided equally, acknowledging my contributions to our decades-long partnership. He also agreed to generous spousal support that ensured I could maintain the lifestyle we had built together and cover my ongoing medical expenses. Richard's business suffered in the aftermath of the scandal. Several clients left uncomfortable with the publicity surrounding his personal life and concerned about his judgment. The financial audit revealed that Natalie had already managed to transfer nearly $200,000 to her offshore accounts, money that was eventually recovered, but not without considerable legal effort. As for Natalie, she faced multiple fraud charges across several states once her pattern of behavior came to light. Other victims came forward after the story hit local news. Last I heard, she was negotiating a plea deal that would still result in significant prison time. Richard's planned wedding never happened, of course. The elaborate venue he had booked for their ceremony, scheduled for the very day our divorce was finalized, sat empty, deposits forfeited. My own healing journey was gradual but steady. The vindication I felt after the court hearing gave way to a deeper process of emotional recovery. I returned to therapy, not just physical, but psychological as well, working through the trauma of both my accident and Richard's betrayal. Diana remained my rock throughout this transition. She helped me reorganize the house to better suit my needs, removing painful reminders of my marriage and creating spaces that reflected my emerging independent identity. She balanced her own life and career with regular visits and calls, never making me feel like a burden. Jackson's transformation was perhaps the most surprising. After witnessing his father's fall from grace and my dignified response, something shifted in his perspective. He began visiting more regularly, initially awkward but gradually more comfortable in my presence. One evening, as we shared dinner, he finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Mom, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The way I defended Dad, the things I said to you, I was wrong, so wrong." "You were loyal to your father," I replied gently. "That's not a bad quality." "But I wasn't loyal to the truth," he insisted. "I blamed you for his choices because it was easier than accepting that my father could be so selfish and cruel. I'm ashamed of that now." His honesty opened the door to healing between us. We began rebuilding our relationship on new terms, adult to adult rather than mother to child. He helped me set up a home office so I could do consulting work using my physical therapy expertise to review treatment plans and provide guidance to younger therapists. This work evolved into something unexpected and fulfilling. I started a support group for people with disabilities facing family challenges, drawing on my professional background and personal experience. What began as a small gathering in my modified living room grew into a community organization with both in-person and online meetings. People facing situations similar to mine, abandoned by partners after accidents or illness, found solidarity and practical advice. Through this work, I met Thomas, a kind-hearted widower whose wife had died after a long battle with multiple sclerosis. He had been her caregiver for 15 years and understood the complexities of disability in a way few others could. We started as friends, sharing resources and stories, but gradually our connection deepened. Thomas never saw my wheelchair as a limitation or burden. He appreciated my resilience and intelligence, my capacity for empathy without self-pity. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. Diana's wedding the following summer became a milestone in my new life. As mother of the bride, I gave a speech that many guests later told me had moved them to tears. I spoke about love that endures through challenges, about the strength found in vulnerability, about the difference between dependency and partnership. I didn't mention Richard directly, but the lessons learned from our marriage and its ending informed every word. Richard attended the wedding at Diana's insistence, sitting quietly in the back during the ceremony and keeping to himself at the reception. He looked older, diminished somehow, the slick facade of his midlife renaissance stripped away. When we briefly crossed paths, he acknowledged me with a nod that contained something like regret. I nodded back, neither warm nor cold, simply acknowledging our shared history and the daughter we both loved. The greatest triumph wasn't the favorable divorce settlement or Richard's comeuppance. It was the discovery that my worth had never been dependent on his validation. My disability hadn't diminished my value as a person, though his perception of me had changed. In the crucible of betrayal, I had found a stronger version of myself, one that didn't need anyone else's approval to feel complete. On the anniversary of the divorce, I wheeled myself out to the garden that Thomas had helped me make accessible with raised beds I could tend from my chair. As I pruned the roses that were just beginning to bloom, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The pain had been real and deep, but it hadn't defined or defeated me. I had faced the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged not just surviving, but thriving. The wheelchair that Richard had seen as a symbol of weakness had become the seat of my strength. My disability had revealed not just his character, but my own resilience. And in the end, that was the most valuable discovery of all. If there's one lesson I've learned through all of this, it's that true strength isn't about physical ability or independence. It's about facing life's challenges with dignity and integrity. It's about recognizing your own worth when others fail to see it. And sometimes it's about letting go of those who cannot grow with you through life's inevitable changes. Have you ever had to reinvent yourself after a betrayal or major life change? Share your story in the comments below. I read every comment and draw inspiration from your experiences. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience and triumph. Remember, whatever challenges you're facing, you are stronger than you know. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you strength and healing on your own journey.